Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 868 for the 25th of May, 2025. Richard Saunders coming to you from an overcast sort of autumn day here in Sydney, Australia. Coming up on this week's show, are you scared of ghosts? Maybe ghosts are scared of you. Ghosts are scared of skeptics. This is a well-known fact, because whenever a skeptical investigator turns up, the ghosts don't. My ramblings and musings on ghosts. Don't you love it when ghost experts, so-called ghost experts, say something like, "Ghosts don't know they're dead." Oh, there you go. Or something like, "Ghosts are here because they're only in limbo." I wonder why, in maybe parts of the world like Europe and so on, that all the ghosts seem to be within the last few centuries, you know. They look like people from the Victorian era, or maybe going back a couple of hundred years, but you don't see many Neanderthal ghosts. No, not many. Cavemen ghosts. We could go on. Following that, it's the Book of Tim, and the final part of the 5-part series, looking at the life and times of Alfred Russel Wallace. And speaking of Tim Mendham, he writes the newsletter this week, read by Adrienne Hill, coming up after the Book of Tim. What's making news in skeptical circles? Then to round off the show, the Trove segment looks once again at the alleged psychic detective Dorothy, Allison, and James Randi. And speaking of James Randi, last week on the show I was mentioning that I was trying to find a good copy of the documentary from way back in 1980 called James Randi in Australia. We have copies which were videotaped 45 years ago, roughly, off the TV. And indeed, I don't even have that videotape anymore. I wonder if a 45-year-old videotape would work. Probably would, but that's gone now, unfortunately. But I do have a copy which I digitised off the video 22 years ago. And that copy is online if you look for James Randi in Australia. There are a couple of versions, one slightly better than the other. Well, listener Glenn Brady got in touch with me and was noticing some of the work and some of the efforts I was undertaking to upscale, to clean up, to upscale the documentary. And together over the last week, we have been working on the documentary, and the results are simply astonishing, or as Randi might say, amazing. Not only did Glenn manage to clean up the video and upscale it, he's fixed up the colours, and I've been spending, well, probably far too many hours going through frame by frame to remove scratches and dirt and things like that. So a big shout out to Glenn, and thank you for your hard work in getting this documentary together, resurrecting it in a sort of a strange sort of way. It's, in fact, some of it would be clearer and sharper than it was when it was first broadcast. A big shout out to everybody who's having a birthday this weekend. I can think of a few people, and you know who you are. Somebody attached to the Skeptical Fairy, I think. And my good friend Steve Roberts has a birthday today. Happy birthday, Steve, the UFO expert from Victoria. Well, that's enough for me at the moment. It's time for me to run downstairs, have something to gargle. I can feel my voice going, which isn't a good thing. It's not really going, it's just not all there. Because in a few days, Tim Mendham and I will be jumping on the train and heading up to Armidale to present at the Armidale Skeptics in the Pub. And this will happen on Wednesday night. If you're in the Armidale area, I hope to see you there. There'll be spoon bending, there'll be water divining, and lots of skeptics to talk to. But now it's time for me to run downstairs and gargle something. Ginger tea. And I'm not going to gargle it, I'm going to drink it. While I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. ghosts, spirits, phantoms, spectres, apparitions, wraiths, poltergeist, ghouls, banshees. Part of every culture's folklore, surely. Famous ghosts in history. Well, there's a famous ghost appears, of course, in the play Hamlet. Can you say Hamlet? You can say it. You can't say Macbeth behind the stage. You can say Hamlet. Anyway, there's a famous ghost in Hamlet. There are stories, ghost stories, dating back millennia, of course, and when we were all growing up, we were told ghost stories, I would imagine. Tales of haunted houses and strange things. The house I grew up in was quite old. It was a Federation house, which meant it was constructed around 1900. And like, well, a lot of old houses, sometimes old houses creak and make strange noises, things that go bump in the night. And my mother was quite happy in the thought that the bumps and the thuds we would hear occasionally were the ghost that lived in the house. The ghosts live in houses. And as a little kid growing up, hearing thumps and bumps and being told it's probably a ghost, well, I thought it was probably a ghost. In more recent times, we have ghost investigation TV shows, which primarily revolve around people in camouflage gear or black t-shirts with electronic equipment running around in the dark with infrared cameras. You know, the green effect where everything seems green. They're poking around in the dark and usually scaring themselves, but, well, it is just for entertainment. Now, during the course of my skeptical investigations, I've gone to a couple of places which are allegedly haunted. And the thing about being a skeptic is that you don't have this fear that many people really do have, sincerely do have. I mean, I can sit in the middle of a graveyard, give me a comfortable chair all night, I don't care. Or an old spooky house, because you can come to terms with the reality of the situation. It's just the same house, but the lights are out. Which reminds me, for years I've been protesting that ghost hunters should do their hunting in the daytime when you can see what's going on. Or turn on all the lights. Strange, isn't it? And I think the most unspooky place I've ever been is an Australian country cemetery in the middle of summer. It does not encourage the ghosts to appear at all. Maybe the cicadas. I was once called in by the Channel 7 network here in Australia because somebody sent them footage from a security camera. Clear proof of a ghost. They said that they had called in spiritualists or psychics who verified that indeed that was a real spirit they'd captured on the camera. It turned out to be a moth. An out-of-focus moth. And maybe I'm right, but ghosts don't appear to be the same thing they were when I was growing up. Do you really hear about ghosts anymore? Is it just something that is slowly ebbing away from our culture and our society? But ghosts are simply unlikely to exist, disembodied spirits of the dead. And we get back to arguments of, can consciousness persist without a body? Where are you? Are you in your brain just waiting for the body to die and then you can be a ghost? For many people, this is a pleasing thought, especially if they're trying to contact their dead relatives. They want to think that some part of their dead relatives is just still there. And we can get into the whole realm of people who knowingly con other people out of their money pretending to talk to the dead, and people who really think they can hear the dead. Despite countless stories, blurry photographs, and late-night ghost hunting TV shows, none of the claims have withstood rigorous scientific scrutiny. From James Randi to the Australian Skeptics. Paranormal investigators rarely use proper scientific equipment on these TV shows. They use things that look flashy, that move, it might as well be the film Ghostbusters. But why do people think they can sense ghosts? I think it's an imagination thing. People let their imaginations run away from them. They're primed. I remember going on a ghost tour, and part of the ghost tour took us down a very long, dark tunnel, an old train tunnel. And we stood there in the dark, and there was a tiny, tiny glimmering of light at the other end of the tunnel. And of course, your brain will make up all sorts of things as you peer into the dimness. And all it needs is somebody to say, the ghosts are at the other end of the tunnel, and people peering, especially if they're believers, to be primed or are primed. It's not surprising. The most ridiculous thing I heard on a ghost tour was, well, two ridiculous things. It was a little town outside of Sydney called Picton. And our tour guide, our ghostly tour guide, told us that the ghosts like to remove the manhole covers in the street. Oh, really? Oh, really? That sounds like a matter for police investigation and insurance. If the ghosts are doing that, that's a public danger issue. The other outrageous thing, we were told, I think we were looking around an old meeting hall or an old theatre or something like that, and the story was that people were in there one night, and somebody said, I can hear a child. There's a child somewhere in this building. I'm not sure. Are they in distress? Oh, don't worry about that. That's just the ghost. Oh, all right. And they left because it was just the ghost. Yeah, I don't think so. Remembering, of course, that public ghost tours are hopefully a little bit of tongue-in-cheek and trying to scare people a little bit. Now, this sort of leads us to cultural conditioning. What people believe about ghosts often aligns with local myths or religious teachings. The media love ghosts. They want people to think that maybe there's a ghost. Let's take the camera crew and find a ghost. We've had reports. And then we get the argument that I've heard from more than one psychic or medium when we go to look for ghosts and we can't find them as skeptics. There's just no evidence or things are explainable. That's because we're skeptics, and that's because the ghosts don't want to deal with us. Well, that's convenient. That's a pity in a way. Actually, I wouldn't mind having a cup of tea with a ghost. Why not? I wonder if you've been on a ghost tour. They're normally interwoven with local history, local historical tours. There's a famous one here in the old part of Sydney, near the harbour. It's called the Rocks, and there's a famous Rocks ghost tour, which means you go from place to place. You hear a ghost story from the tour guide, but you look at an historical building or historical little bit of Sydney. So you have to take that with a pinch of salt. And that time that Maynard and I and Alethea Dean, former president of Australian Skeptics, went to the Fields of Mars Cemetery with a bunch of paranormal investigators to wait for ghosts. It was a very hot night, and heat might be a reason the ghosts stayed away. I don't know. We were too busy fanning ourselves. The strangest thing that happened on that night was a bus load of women on a hen's party turned up, opened the door, they all poured out, saw Maynard, and were quite taken with the fact that Maynard was part of their hen's night. That was spooky. But just harking back to a previous point, it's easy for me to say I could just stand anywhere, go to a haunted house and just sit down and just wait, and it doesn't matter to me. That's not to take away the genuine angst and fear some people have in the merest thought of doing the same. I've spoken to people who could not would not, but could not physically go into a so-called haunted house at night. They would be petrified. They would have true terror, and we must appreciate that. For whatever reason, thousands of people, many people, of course, still believe in ghosts, and a small minority of those people would believe that ghosts could somehow bring them to harm. And of course, it doesn't matter that you don't hear on the news that 3 people were harmed by a ghost last night in a haunted house. It never happens. But that doesn't stop the natural fear people have, and it's understandable. I mean, it's good to be wary of the dark. It really is. We were evolved to do that. Anyway, just a few musings on ghosts. I remember that when I first became active in the Australian Skeptics, I thought, great, every week I can go out and hunt for ghosts. Yeah, after a while, when the ghosts don't appear, and it's the same old, well, it gets a bit old, really. So, whether you're about to give up the ghost, and you haven't got a ghost of a chance, maybe you're so scared you're as white as a ghost. Look for the skeleton in the closet. That's if you're not haunted by the past. Maybe you're in high spirits and visiting a ghost town. If you do all that, be sure to write a book using a ghost writer.
Hello, I'm Annie McCubbin. Do you have a friend who gets their dietary advice from Jade the Influencer? Their financial and relationship advice from Crystal the Psychic? Has detoxes and colonics from Alice the Naturopath, and thinks vaccines cause autism and made the world flat? Are you sick of trying to convince them that they're being conned? Well, argue no more. Let me do it instead. Give them the link to my podcast, Why Smart Women, and sit back with a turmeric latte and immune-boosting supplement and relax. Actually, cut the turmeric latte and immune-boosting supplement. It's pointless. Just grab a cup of tea and tune into my podcast, Why Smart Women. See you soon.
And now, a reading from the Book of Tim, with Tim Mendham.
Hi, my name is Tim Mendham. I'm the editor of the Australian Skeptics journal, The Skeptic, and Executive Officer for Australian Skeptics Inc. And today we're reading the final part 5, on the story of Alfred Russel Wallace, as published in The Skeptic magazine, June 2024, which is volume 44, number 2, called Unnatural Selection, and written by yours truly. Before we were looking at Wallace's history of scientific development, he was the co-originator of the theory of natural selection, often unacknowledged these days, but in his time he was regarded as a leading scientist of society. The trouble was he also got involved in some very unscientific areas, phrenology, spiritualism, and quite seriously the anti-vaccination movement. But importantly, there was one particular topic and a bit of writing by him that put him in deep trouble with his scientific colleagues. This was a review in response to revised editions of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology and Elements of Geology. Apparently Lyell was an inveterate reviser, but in this case he seemed to be finally coming around to natural selection. But Wallace's response, published in the Quarterly Review, seemed to turn the tables on that notion, his and Darwin's notion that they had fought so hard to develop and which had made both of their names. He had written to Darwin before publication that he intended to point out some limitations on the theory. Quote, limitations on the theory. I'm afraid that Huxley, and perhaps yourself, will think them weak and unphilosophical. They most certainly did. He concluded that the human brain could not have evolved by natural selection at all, and neither could associated anatomical features such as organs of speech, dexterous hands, and bipedal locomotion. His reasoning for this was both shocking and disappointing. Quote, such, we believe, is the direction in which we shall find the true reconciliation of science with theology on this most momentous problem. Let us fearlessly admit that the mind of man, itself the living proof of a supreme mind, is able to trace, and to a considerable extent has traced, the law by means of which the organic, no less than the inorganic world has been developed. But let us not shut our eyes to the evidence that an overruling intelligence has watched over the action of those laws, so directing variations and so determining their accumulation, as finally to produce an organisation sufficiently perfect to admit of and even to aid in the indefinite advancement of our mental and moral nature. Here was someone who had rejected traditional religion and the notion of a creator throughout his life, and who was a pioneer of the concept of undirected natural selection. Now he was turning to the solution of a supreme being or intelligence to direct evolution with a purpose and aim of man as the perfect outcome of the process. Some suggested that his apparent turnaround was the outcome of his belief in spiritualism and the emotional disappointments he had suffered during his life. Darwin in particular was not impressed. He wrote to Wallace, "As you expected, I differ grievously from you, and I am very sorry for it. And elsewhere, I hope you have not murdered too completely your own and my child." Wallace's belief that human consciousness could not be entirely a product of purely natural causes was shared by a number of prominent intellectuals in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. All the same, many, including Huxley and Darwin himself, were critical of Wallace's views. Many didn't forget or forgive his apparent heresy. While he continued to be supported in his science, his reputation had been stained and diminished, so much so that he was almost overlooked to attend Darwin's funeral ceremony in Westminster Abbey in April 1882, though he was eventually included as a pallbearer. The two Wallaces were to remain a feature of his life until the end, often to his cost. As the US National Library of Medicine's National Centre for Biotechnology Information says in a discussion of his anti-vaccination and other beliefs, Wallace was modern, but he represented an alternative version of modernity, a version that has been sidelined in historiography until recently, but has lately been acknowledged as a central cultural feature of the late 19th century. Movements such as spiritualism were not resurrections of ancient traditions, but used interpretations of the most recent natural science, such as experimental psychology, evolutionary biology, and astronomy, or electromagnetism. Some, like Wallace, also contested the social role that emerging professional sciences should play. Wallace, it continues, strongly favoured a natural science that also addressed moral, political, social and metaphysical concerns. And with this inclination, he ran against the tide that was more concerned with developing a barrier between politics and disinterested, objective science. In the case of vaccination, Wallace argued that liberty and science need to be taken into account, but that liberty is far more important than science. Wallace only appears to have been such a heretical figure if a large portion of the social, political and intellectual reality of Victorian and Edwardian England is blotted out of the picture. Despite his position as one of the foremost naturalists in the United Kingdom, this status did not translate into a permanent position or even some semblance of financial security. He was never a good investor, and he relied largely on income from his writings to support him and his family. Only in 1881, after an intervention by Darwin and other eminent scientists, did he receive a civil list pension of £200 per year. He continued to be acknowledged by his peers on both sides of the coin. He became president of the anthropology section of the British Association in 1866 and of the Entomological Society of London in 1870. He was elected to the American Philosophical Society in 1873. The British Association elected him as head of its biology section in 1876. He was elected to the Royal Society in 1893, and he received honorary doctorates and professional honours such as the Royal Society's Royal Medal in 1868 and, ironically, its Darwin Medal in 1890. And a year earlier, he was asked to chair a meeting in London of the International Congress of Spiritualists. In 2023, the Harvard Museum of Natural History, as part of the activities on the 200th anniversary of his birth, created a special Wallace-themed cocktail in recognition of his legacy. There's no indication as to the ingredients. Nonetheless, in the popular and even scientific mind, Wallace will always be in the shadow of Darwin, cruelly described not as his peer, but as the first Darwinian, a portrait subservient to Darwin's imposing statue in the Natural History Museum, with his own statue hidden away in a corridor, a tree stump in a small English village instead of a plaque in Westminster Abbey, a footnote in the history of Darwinian evolution. But to those who knew him and know of him now, in the world of the development of Victorian science and social debate, he was preeminent. And despite his lapses into pseudoscience and their occasional and sometimes vituperative disagreements, his contemporaneous colleagues stuck by him, supported him and lauded him. By the time of his death, he had written 22 books and over 1,000 articles and published letters. And it all started with one particular letter produced over a few feverish nights in an isolated hut in the East Indies that Wallace sent to Darwin in 1858, wondering if he thought his novel idea on the evolution of life might be of any interest. And that's the conclusion to our story on Alfred Russel Wallace, 5 parts, a bit long, but that appears in the July 2024 issue of The Skeptic, which is volume 44, number 2. Pretty soon you'll be able to get a copy of that online, but not at the moment. But you can get an actual copy of the article online at any time by downloading the sample issue that we have at the top of the magazine lists on the website, skeptics.com.au.
Allora ciao, io mi chiamo Professore Dave, io ti voglio insegnare tutte le cose sulla scienza. Parliamo di fisica, di chimica, biologia, astronomia, matematica e tante altre cose. Guardami su YouTube, arrivederci. Hey everyone, this is Professor Dave. I want to teach you about all kinds of things regarding science. I want to tell you about physics. I want to tell you about chemistry, biology, astronomy, math, and many, many more things. Come check me out on YouTube. The channel is called Professor Dave Explains. Take it easy.
He knows a lot about the science stuff. Professor Dave Explains.
Hello everyone, this is Adrienne Hill and I'm here in Raleigh, North Carolina, USA, and I'm going to read the highlights from the Australian Skeptics Newsletter. This is newsletter number 222. Don't forget, you can sign up to this newsletter at skeptics.com.au and get the full report complete with all the links every other week right into your inbox. But now, let's see what Tim Mendham has for us this week. Hi all, says Tim. Is there anything more frustrating and disturbing than an increase in incidence and a reduction in vaccination against preventable diseases? Active anti-vaxxers may be a small cohort. Professor Raina McIntyre, in an article mentioned later, says they make up about 2% of the population. But quote, the hesitant people are a much larger group, maybe 10%. People who are vaccine hesitant, who do not feel they have been listened to adequately by health professionals, may be more vulnerable to recruitment by the anti-vaccine lobby, end quote. In contrast, see the 30% of Americans who are vaccine skeptics. Listen to the story later. So stay tuned. Reaching hesitant people with truthful and effective information is a prime function for skeptics. It's also one of the most difficult, not the truthful info part, just the effective part. In this area, every skeptic should be an activist. The armchairs are full of old springs and cat hair, so it's time to wave a flag and block out the occasional anti-vax advocate in the process. In the meantime, read on. Tim. Okay, Tim, I'll do just that. Skepticon 2025, call for papers. Skepticon, the Australian Skeptics Annual National Convention, will be returning to Melbourne for the 12th time this year in the weekend of October 3rd through 5th. The Victorian Skeptics, organisers of the event, have announced a call for papers. Quote, we are looking forward to a broad range of participants, including first-time convention speakers, and hope to shine a spotlight on the efforts of energetic people from within our movement as well as outstanding people from outside of our fold who have much to share with us, end quote. The Skepticon website has full details at skepticon.org.au. including the submission form. The 41st convention will be held at the Forum Theatre, University of Melbourne. Keep your eyes on the website for more details as they are announced, including the Friday social night and Saturday night dinner. Australia's childhood vaccination rates risk herd immunity. Australia's childhood vaccination rates have steadily declined since COVID-19, dropping below the coverage required to achieve herd immunity from some diseases. Measles cases reach highest levels in 6 years. The National Notifiable Disease Surveillance System shows 71 measles cases have been reported across Australia in 2025, exceeding the total for 2024. It's reached the highest number recorded since 2019. 30% of Americans are vaccine skeptics. According to a Value Penguin survey of 2,000 plus U.S. consumers, 30% of Americans agree with RFK Jr.'s so-called vaccine skepticism, with Republicans, 50%, significantly more likely to say so than Democrats, 16%. 45% also think only some vaccines are effective. We have to say that this article has one of the silliest bar charts we have ever seen. It has one item, no timeline, no alternatives, just a lone blue square to indicate 30%. And as a side note, I just saw in the news this week there was a sold-out Shakira concert in New Jersey in a stadium that can hold more than 80,000 people. And there is now a health alert from New Jersey officials regarding a possible measles exposure since an attendee has contracted the disease. Oh, and in my home province of Alberta, as of May 18th, there are now 438 cases, up from the 20 or so that were documented on this show when I was in Australia a month ago. Lib leaders' neurological past. Here's some background on the newly elected Australian Liberal Party leader, Susan Lee's brush with numerology. Surprisingly, this is a crikey article, which is currently, hopefully still, on open access, unlike most paywalled crikey articles. There is another more critical discussion on Lee's background by Gary Nunn, who has written previously on psychics. See The Skeptic, September 2021, pages 24 through 27. European project to remove contrails. And chemtrails? Though this article doesn't mention it, others have pointed out that this project to mitigate contrails will play havoc with chemtrail conspiracies. How Ireland's police deal with psychic tip-offs. This is based on the headline. This 10-minute interview sounds credulous, but in fact is quite skeptical and realistic, and it's worth spending a few minutes to review. Global skeptics in the pub. Following on last year's event, the International Global Skeptics in the Pub will begin at 7 p.m. local time in New Zealand on Friday, the 22nd of August, and will go around the world and end at 9 p.m. local time in Hawaii, 24 hours later on the same calendar day. This event will take place via Zoom, and more details are to come. Quote, building trust for a more informed future, end quote, presentations. These are recordings of presentations from an MIT Press/Aspen Institute Science and Society Program conference in March on bridging, quote, the gap between the evidence base on how humans process and understand information and the vulnerabilities to misinformation and propaganda we endure when we fail to leverage this knowledge in communicating science, especially in the age of generative AI, end quote. Attendees included science communicators, journalists, researchers, students, and policymakers from around the globe. The next and final, sadly, issue of The Skeptic is in progress. It will feature a look back at the history of the magazine and other historical events. Meanwhile, the March 2025 issue is out, featuring a look at folklore, the fun, fashions, and fakes, as well as an in-depth look at 2 cancer cure influencers in the news and on TV, Wellness Woo, Coulthardt's latest definitive proof of UFOs, at least this week's version, and a full report on Skepticon 40, or XL, or Extra Large. You can read the article on the infamous Belle Gibson in the preview of the March issue, which is available on our website. Items of interest. Travel tips. The best place to visit in Europe, according to your star sign. Quote, renowned celebrity psychic and astrologer Inbal Honigman, end quote, whose terrible horse race predictions we covered a few newsletters ago, has predicted which European holiday spots will bring the most luck for every star sign this summer. Quote, by reading the energies and opportunities that lie ahead, she claims to have identified the most astrologically aligned destinations for each zodiac, end quote. And yours truly got one of the boring ones. End of the world, several times over. Craig Hamilton Parker, often referred to as the new Nostradamus, has predicted 4 wars that could spark World War III in the next 100 days. Well, this story appeared on May 5th, by the way, so make that the next 85 days. Surprisingly, he has named the India-Pakistan border, China-Taiwan, Ukraine, and Israel-Gaza, and thrown in an Indian invasion of Nepal for good measure. Uncanny. Or not. The Ogopogo, filmed by a Canadian woman? Ooh! I grew up looking for the Ogopogo when I was on my grandparents' boat, despite my grandparents assuring me that it did not exist. So this is an interesting, if not that definitive film. But the witness to this sighting in Canada's Okanagan Lake says it is not the wake of a boat. So it's probably the wake of a boat. Did a medieval saint wrongly predict the number of popes before the end times? Yes. Now that's all for the newsletter. And to finish off, I want to talk a little bit about an experience I had while I was being a tour guide for Coleman from the Think This Through YouTube channel and Daniel Watts last week. And I made what I thought was a normal statement by saying that we would travel to the mountains only if they weren't socked in. They looked at me strangely, and I realized they didn't understand the phrase socked in. And I'm presently staying with friends of the show, Faith and Romero Rodriguez, in Raleigh, and they also had never heard the expression. And the possible origins of the saying surprised me. According to the American Meteorological Society, the term likely originated from the early days of aviation regarding the visibility of the windsocks at airports. Now, a windsock is a fabric tube mounted on a pole to indicate wind direction on runways. And when visibility is low due to fog, low cloud, or heavy rain, the windsock is difficult to see, which leads to the expression socked in, showing that flying is not a good idea at that time. The phrase has expanded to include any situation where visibility is restricted, such as being unable to see the mountains due to the weather or smoke from fires. Until next time, this is Adrienne Hill from Raleigh Studios in the United States.
Hi, I'm Leslie Rosenblood, host of Podcast for Inquiry, the official podcast of the Centre for Inquiry Canada. Every 2 weeks, I bring you a conversation with an expert on some complex subject, which we discuss with intelligence and nuance. The goal is that you come away with more than just a surface-level understanding, as well as an appreciation for a genuine spirit of inquiry. If your intellectual curiosity extends to science, religion, philosophy, economics, humanism, politics, and more, subscribe to Podcast for Inquiry today, available anywhere you get your podcasts. A video form is also available on YouTube on the Centre for Inquiry Canada's channel. I look forward to welcoming you to the inquiring community.
Now it's time once again to go back to the archives, the digital archives of newspapers from around the world. Normally, of course, at TROVE, the Australian resource. But this week, we're following on from a look into the career of alleged self-proclaimed psychic detective, who I'm only just really starting to learn about, Dorothy Allison. Now, Dorothy Allison gained a reputation of being a psychic detective, and one wonders how she got this reputation, probably from her own publicity, and probably from the fact that press, by and large, haven't got time to check the bona fides of what people say. They just report stories, interesting stories. And last week we discovered that Dorothy Allison died, when was it, 1999, and she claimed credit for solving hundreds of cases and finding missing people and murderers, and on it goes. Have a listen to last week's episode to refresh your memory. But we're going to follow up now with a big story I found here concerning Dorothy Allison and James Randi, and this was published in the where is it now? At the top of the page here, published in the Spokane Chronicle, Monday the 21st of June 1982, page 12 if you're interested. A story by Tim Mendham of the Chronicle, it says. Okay, and it's under the section called Ascent, and the title of the piece is called Challenging Psychics. Is supernatural phenomena a fraud, or will it stand up under scrutiny? For nearly 2 decades, James Randi has had a standing offer of $10,000 payable to anyone who can demonstrate one authentic act of supernatural power. Randi, better known as the Amazing Randi, is a magician and escape artist who is also one of the most brutal critics of those who claim paranormal abilities. One of Randi's favourite targets is Dorothy Allison, the New Jersey psychic who recently visited Spokane to work with police in their search for 2 Spokane women missing since last fall. Allison spent 3 days with homicide detectives investigating the mysterious disappearances of bank teller Shelley Anderson, last seen September 14, and Kathy Gregory, a registered nurse at Deaconess Hospital who failed to report for work on the afternoon of November 4. The psychic told police a month ago the body would be, quote, found soon, end quote. But attempts to locate a body or other evidence which would lead investigators to solve either case, however, failed completely. Now, what we can do, of course, what was unavailable to people at the time, psychics and police alike, was we can now look through the historical records to see. And in the case of Shelley Anderson, she was killed by her estranged husband and buried in the backyard in a suitcase. And her estranged husband was sent to prison. However, he did, according to a report I'm seeing here, he did finish his sentence or was given a reprieve or something in 2005. And as for the nurse Kathy Gregory, the latest information I have on that is that disappearance remains unsolved. A tragedy, of course. Well, both are a tragedy, of course, for the families involved. So we bear that in mind, that in the case of Shelley Anderson, she was murdered by her estranged husband, and in the case of Kathy Gregory, she remains missing to this very day. Presumed murdered, we would have to say. So we pick up the story. Although more than 650 persons have applied to win Randi's $10,000, fewer than 60 have passed Randi's preliminary checks. Of that number, not one person has succeeded in relieving the bearded magician of his prize money. Randi says his check for $10,000 has never been more safe. Quote, "Now that doesn't prove there aren't such things as supernatural, occult or paranormal powers," end quote. Randi recently told the Chronicle by telephone from his home in Rumson, New Jersey. Quote, "But what it does prove is that of all these people making loud noises about having magical powers, not one has been able to prove it under proper observing conditions. You'd think all that one of them would have to do is come forward, do it, collect the $10,000, walk away, laughing, and I'd look like some kind of fool," end quote. Randi says he does not believe in psychics or other persons who make claims to extraordinary powers, simply because he has never seen any proof. Quote, "The philosopher Seneca said it many years ago, it is the quality of the evidence that counts. And that is absolutely true. One good piece of evidence for the existence of the paranormal would outweigh all of the other flim-flam evidence that they have, which is very, very bad. It just doesn't stand examination," end quote, Randi said in the interview. Allison has co-authored an autobiography in which she claims to have used her, quote, "unique powers in more than 100 baffling crimes or disappearances," end quote. The book claims her first psychic experience was at the age of 14, when she had a premonition of her father's death the day before he died. Since then, Allison has travelled extensively throughout the United States and has worked with numerous law enforcement agencies. Sometimes reports of her brassy, outspoken psychic's performance are favourable. Other times, Allison leaves towns and cities with its police detectives seething. The favourable words come from people like Sergeant Don Vic Vaccaro, a police officer in Nutley, New Jersey, who first worked with Allison in 1968 on a case involving a missing boy, later found to have drowned. According to her book, Allison made a number of correct psychic predictions, including how the child had died and what he was wearing and when he would be found. Vaccaro apparently was so impressed with Allison that he worked with her on several cases over the next 10 years. "I think she's very good," Vaccaro told the Chronicle recently. "I've said it before. I feel that she's about 75% right, and the other 25% we don't know because nobody has investigated that far." Here in Washington, support for Allison comes from Ponderay County Sheriff Tony Belmonte. The sheriff who worked with Allison on a murder case he was investigating in 1980 said his experience with her has been, quote, "real positive," end quote. Belmonte said Allison was, quote, "extremely accurate," end quote, about details of the case, which included how the victim had died and a description of the victim's clothing. "She started telling me things that she could not have known," Belmonte said. "Something's there, and if it's read right, it'll add up." There are other supporters too, but Randi is not buying the story at all. Quote, "Dorothy Allison is a flim-flam artist of the first water," end quote, Randi said, insisting that the famous New Jersey psychic has never actually located one body or one killer. Quote, "She's one of the people I'm really out to get," end quote, Randi said. Quote, "I think that woman is an absolute disgrace," end quote. Randi is not Allison's only critic. Two detectives in Paterson, New Jersey, for example, told the Chronicle that the psychic offered them money if they would lie to the press about her involvement in finding the body of a murdered 8-year-old boy. Paterson Police Detective Harold Pegg and George Brejak, now a private investigator for a New Jersey law firm, said Allison worked with them for about a week on the case, but was unable to provide any helpful information. She pointed us in all the wrong directions, Peg said recently. The detectives worked on the case for 3 weeks before they discovered the child's body and arrested the suspect. On the day the body was discovered, Peg and Brijac claimed that Allison came into the detective office and openly praised the detectives for their work. Then, speaking alone with Peg and Brijac, Allison said that she wanted the story for her book and asked them to tell the press that she helped locate the child's body, the detectives claim. Voice. She said this was one of the most sensational child murders she'd ever been involved with, Brijac said. She said, I'll pay you good money. I'll take good care of you. I need this for my book. When they interview you on television, tell them that I'm the one who told you where the body was. Both men refused and Allison was asked to leave their office, Brijac said. The detectives further charged that Allison asked him and Peg to give her a set of phony police reports. She wanted me and my partner to give her false police reports that would indicate that she had something to do with solving the murder, Brijac said. I said, you must be crazy. No way in the world, man, no way. When asked by a Chronicle reporter about the detective's allegation, Allison said the two policemen were lying. Allison has also drawn criticism from policemen in Atlanta, Georgia, after she travelled there in October 1980 to help police locate the killer of more than a score of young black men and children. Among other things, Allison claims she told police the killer was a black man who worked in the media. She also said she provided investigators with the names of some suspects. Other reports, however, indicate that Allison told the police there were two killers, one black and one white. Also, when contacted by the Chronicle, Atlanta Police Sergeant D.C. Gundlach said Allison gave investigators 42 suspect names. Gundlach said the department's experience with Allison was, quote, all negative, end quote, and that the psychic provided officials with no helpful information. Allison also reportedly proved of little value when she visited the police department in Columbus, Georgia, several years ago. Curtis McClung, then Columbus police chief, and his detectives were trying to find the killer of 7 senior citizens who had been strangled. McClung, now retired from the police department and teaching at Albany State College, told the Chronicle Allison was of no help whatsoever. She had a whole lot of things to say about the problems in Columbus, but provided no specific information that assisted in the investigations at all, the soft-spoken McClung said recently. She seemed sincere enough and appeared to want to help, but she didn't provide any helpful information. Several of these psychics showed up in Columbus during that period of time, and almost all of them say so much and make so many comments that the chances are, sooner or later, if the cases are solved, that something they say may apply. McClung said the killer of the strangled women was never caught. In Spokane, Sheriff's Detective Mike Massong worked with Allison on a murder case several years ago. Massong said he was surprised that the psychic was able to tell him details about the case that had taken him months of tough detective work to find out. The veteran detective said he was somewhat less impressed with Allison's powers after he discovered that a supervisor had allowed her to read police reports concerning the case before he began working with her. By far, Dorothy Allison's strongest critic is Randi. Quote, one of her techniques is to tell police literally hundreds of things, end quote, said Randi. Quote, the colour brown, the initial M. I see a key. I see a ring of wire. I see a set of coat hangers. I hear a jingling noise. Wet ground. The smell of oil. A pair of scissors. And on like this forever. Then, of course, if a murder is solved and one of the items she mentions is involved in the case, like a pair of scissors, she will say, aha, a pair of scissors. Remember, I said a pair of scissors. End quote. Randi's description of Allison's psychic technique and his characterizations of her as an outright fraud, of course, infuriate the woman. Tell him to shut his motor mouth, Allison recently told the Chronicle reporter. Tell him it's a shame he has to be so jealous. Tell him I said his mind is so small. Tell him to go cut up some women on stage. And by that we can assume that she means Randi should go back to being a stage magician and saw women in half and things like that. When asked why she will not accept Randi's $10,000 challenge so that the veracity of her claims to psychic powers can be properly tested under controlled circumstances, Allison said, "Who the hell is he? He's not God. Who is he to control anything?" Allison said, "As God is my witness, I swear to this. I try to be as honest as I possibly can. I am not a phony." And to Randi's charge that she is a flim-flam artist, "Tell him I think he needs psychiatric care," Allison said. "Tell him he's so jealous and vicious, and tell him any time he wants to challenge me on what I've done, let him. I invite him and all his so-called scientists who have studied psychics to come into my home, and I'll show how psychic I am." How will she do that? "I'll get psychic for them, but I'll find all the bad first, right in front of them. I can get psychic right then and there. But what I'll do is give them a future reading." "You want a future reading right now?" The reporter said, "Yes, that would be interesting." "Tell him that starting in December and for 2.5 years after, that he's going to be faced with the most horrible 2.5 years of his life. Tell him that is my prediction. It will be hell on earth for him. Tell him this is one time he's going to get caught up with his own mouth. That ought to tickle his tonsils a little bit." When told of Allison's gloomy prediction, Randi said he thought the last 2.5 years were pretty bad. Quote, "I wonder what this could be," end quote, said Randi. Quote, "This must be raining locusts in my living room or something. Of course, a future reading isn't much help in testing Allison's alleged powers until the future is already gone by," end quote. Randi says he intends to go on to, quote, "bigger and better things in the next 2.5 years," end quote. And when December comes, is not going to take any more notice of the month than to send out Christmas cards. Quote, "I'm really not going to sit and lose any sleep over it," end quote, said Randi. Quote, "I'm sure that the next 2.5 years, starting in December, will be the most prosperous, happy, and productive of my life, because her usual rate on this sort of thing is so bad that you can take exactly the opposite as being very true," end quote. During a final conversation with the Chronicle, Randi mentioned a book entitled, quote, "Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds," end quote, written in 1841. In that book, author Charles Mackay discusses a number of classic cases in which members of the public have been led away from rational thinking by superstitions or crowd hysteria and have allowed themselves to fall victim to their own gullibility. Randi praises the book. Quote, "Mackay says that man's disaffection with his present state and with his foreseeable future is one of the most aggravating things that visits him," end quote. Randi said, quote, "It tears him apart and makes him seek all kinds of strange solutions. In other words, his dissatisfaction, his need to improvise his future and his state, is what has made him into a human being rather than just some beast of the fields. And it's absolutely true. It's both a curse and a blessing at the same time, because failing to deal with that dissatisfaction in his lifespan, he would tend naturally to jump to goblins and Allisons and all that sort of thing in a search for something spooky and romantic up ahead. But if he doesn't make that leap, then the race moves forward and the species moves backwards. Otherwise, it flies back into the caves." And that's the end of the article. Let's see, that was in 1982. And in the next couple of decades, Randi's career as a skeptical investigator went forward, and he was to go on to found the James Randi Educational Foundation, of course. Well, there we are, a lengthy article, which is a follow-up to last week's Trove segment about Dorothy Allison. And what an interesting article that is, and we can discover that it would appear that she was absolutely no help in solving the cases of those missing women, one of whom sadly was murdered and buried in the backyard, and the other of whom has never been found. Now, I think in about a month or so, I think in late June or early July, we'll be doing a series in the Trove segment and other newspapers about more exploits of James the Amazing Randi. That's coming up a bit later on in some weeks' time. But for now, of course, you can find out all about psychic detectives and their failures or their alleged successes by going to Trove at trove.nla.gov.au, or, as I've been doing recently, looking at things like Google newspapers, and I've found some other ones too, through the Internet Archive service. Because when you go there and you have a look around and you do a search, well, you never know what you might find. Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Thank you to those people who contribute with PayPal or Patreon at skepticzone.tv. Your contributions go a very long way indeed. And thank you to Dan, who has just become a new $5 Patreon subscriber. Looking forward to seeing you in the New England area in Armidale. And this will be this Wednesday in the Welder's Dog Brewery. Come along for my talk, The Secrets of the Psychics. And once again, a big shout out to my teacher friends who are probably, even now, are at home working on their various school work they have to do. And thank goodness they do it. More money for teachers, I say. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia.
You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for episodes and show notes with links going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone on Facebook, X, TikTok and YouTube by clicking the links at our homepage, together with links to support the show financially via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed by our guests are not necessarily those of the Skeptic Zone podcast or any other skeptical organisation.